Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you. Senator Round. Senator Menendez of New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad to see the Banking Committee is interested in foreign affairs issues, so good to have the hearing. Let me ask Mr. Smith. OFAC issued 2 general licenses on September 24th to better facilitate the flow of humanitarian aid to Afghanistan. How exactly do these licenses work? And how does the Treasury ensure that assistance does not go to the Taliban or the Haqqani network?
Thank you, Senator. Both of those are very good questions. The way the licenses work, well, maybe to begin with, why the licenses are needed. So both the Haqqani network and the Taliban are sanctioned parties, which means that any individual who's a U.S. person, U.S. company, U.S. party, non-U.S. party that engages through the United States cannot engage with them without risking criminal and civil liability. And so these licenses allow exemptions, allow certain exemptions that are specified in the licenses to provide certain goods that are articulated within the licenses to certain individuals and certain parties. So one license covers the activities of sort of the NGO community, right, which includes sort of not just the U.S. government as a large as a government organization, but the multilateral organizations and non-governmental organizations as well, providing humanitarian services. And then the other license is principally to do with the delivery of food, foodstuffs, medicine, et cetera. As well. So both of those licenses allow activities that would otherwise be prohibited, namely potential transactions with parties that would be sanctioned. And those licenses allow those exemptions to allow, hopefully, the activities that are articulated. Now, there's a good question, and Ranking Member Toomey, I think, asked this question as well. How do you make sure that the benefits don't go to the Taliban? And it's a great question. And I think that the way the licenses are structured and, frankly, the reporting obligations and the oversight that people are going to impose on the licenses are going to require sort of a lot of care and carefulness with respect to parties who want to use them. But I think one of the key pieces that makes this perhaps less likely to be abused in that fashion is what they're asking to be delivered, usually, at least on the second license with respect to medicine and medical devices, are hard goods, right, in-kind goods, as opposed to just funds. So is it possible that in-kind goods could be taken off a truck by the Taliban and sold on the market for hard currency? Of course it could. It is significantly more difficult, however, for that to happen than if just cash was put into the system in the hands of anybody. So I think that that's the key issue here, is they're trying to focus much more on in-kind goods and services rather than simply cash flows.
Well, you have a Taliban government that has Haqqani sanctioned individuals in its government. And so while we want to, of course, assist the Afghan people, we have to be robustly resolute that the Taliban does not get access to these funds, especially when we have sanctioned individuals in their government. Otherwise, our sanctions regime is meaningless at the end of the day. Let me ask you, the OFAC general licenses, I'll ask both you and Mr. Eckert, were welcomed by humanitarian organizations as a necessary protection for those NGOs seeking to stay and deliver in time of skyrocketing humanitarian need in Afghanistan. However, we've seen in other contexts general licenses are sometimes necessary, but not necessarily sufficient to ensure humanitarian NGOs have sufficient financial access to provide assistance in crisis area under the control of sanctioned actors. What additional actions should OFAC consider to safeguard aid operations in Afghanistan? If the United States chooses to differentiate between sanctioned Taliban officials and ministry bureaucrats that work under them, how do we ensure that the Taliban doesn't divert away from the vulnerable groups?
Ms. Eckert?
Thank you, Mr. Menendez. In terms of dealing for the NGOs, it's very important, and the administration took the very critical step of authorizing the transmission of goods, services, et cetera, of NGOs for the range of humanitarian activities that meet basic human needs. But that's only part of the question. The other is, how do funds get to the NGOs in country. And right now, there's a critical liquidity crisis. The banks have limited to $200 a week the amount of withdrawals that can happen. We've frozen the cash. The Taliban is enormously strapped. The central bank does not have Afghani notes, and they don't have U.S. dollars. So there's a real liquidity crisis. So for U.S. banks or for banks to support humanitarian action, they're going to be very hesitant to send funds into Afghanistan, and legitimately so, because even the banks who don't have an interest by the government have very significant concerns about to whom they can let the funds go. So in the short term, I think one of the things that the U.S. and the international community needs to do is to establish this unique safe payment mechanism in order to negotiate the transmission of funds for humanitarian and NGO activities to ensure that they go to those activities. And this is something that will require thought and, as Adam notes, creativity. But it's something that we need to work with the financial system because there's no incentive. There are places that banks are not going to take the risk of transferring funds. I've had financial institutions tell me, North Korea, for example, even though there's humanitarian needs there, they do not want certain transactions on their books. So they're being very hesitant. And in order to encourage them, once the financial situation in Afghanistan stabilizes, because right now we do have this liquidity crisis, but once it stabilizes, we're going to need to provide some level of encouragement. And there are a number of things that can be done in discussion with financial institutions. One of them is actually providing some kind of formalization of OFAC's policy about non-enforcement. But there are a number of things that need to take place as part of the discussion with financial institutions. But right now, they're not going to be able to get the funds in. We need a channel to get funds and goods that can go to for these purposes and to be controlled so the Taliban does not have access to it.
Oh, thank you. I'll be monitoring this very closely. Thank you.
So thanks, Senator Menendez. Senator